driving out, heading for the West Coast. I got my big thick novel and a pocket of mementos. Set up on the county, far from Kings. I don't own any pictures, I'm just betting on my dreams. And just singing la 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 la, just singing la 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 la. Saw a sunset, first one in my life. 24 years in with a mortgage and a wife. So I'm driving, driving, driving. Gonna keep on driving, driving, driving. And I call you back when I lie. Just singing la 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 la, just singing la 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 la. And I can't remember how I got along with you. Know it's coming on September. I can't say that I'll see you soon. See you soon. So, Isabel, won't you take this down? I got a brand new number, 40 miles from town. So, Isabel, won't you take this down? I got a brand new number, I'm just 1,000 miles from town. It's a pleasure to be here. Frank asked if I would play some songs for you, so I'll do one more and then he can start talking. Exactly, it's hard until then, and Morgan, of course. And I had one song in mind in particular, and he also mentioned that same song. It's kind of like do my own version of a song called Mississippi by Bob Dylan. If you read a few pages, and this may ring a bell, as Frank was listening to the album on September 11th in the vinyl shop, and it's a good song. So I'll just do a few verses and make sure I stick to it on the show. So thank you. Every step of the way, we walk the line. Your days are numbered, So are mine. Time's pulling up. We struggle and we scrape. All boxed in, got nowhere to escape. City's just a jungle, more games to play. All trapped in the heart of it, trying to get away. I was raised in the country, been working in the town. I've been in trouble since I set my suitcase down. There's nothing you can sell me, so see you around. All my powers of expression, thoughts so blind, can never do you justice, reason or rhyme. There's only one thing that I did wrong. I stayed in Mississippi a day too long. There's only one thing that I did wrong. I stayed in Mississippi a day too long. I stayed in Mississippi a day too long.
Xavier Cardriche, people, everybody, please. What a joy to kick off this night with Xavier's music. He told me when we were talking earlier that he spent some time as a child on the road, accompanying his father on lengthy road trips, and was really captivated by the different music he heard in different parts of the country. And since this night is about a road trip, it's especially fitting to have Xavier kick us off. So thank you so much, Xavier. I want to tell you, just in case you're curious, he performs internationally and locally, solo and with his band, and he recently released his fourth album and first live recording of original material. It's titled Be My Voice, and if you want to find out more, you can go to xaviercardriche.com and sign up for his newsletter, his email newsletter. So welcome, everyone. My name is Marcia Eli. I'm here on behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library, the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents, and of course the Center for Brooklyn History. Tonight, we are very excited to be hosting Bloomberg opinion columnist Frank Barry, whose new book, Backroads and Better Angels, A Journey into the Heart of American Democracy, chronicles the insights he gleaned when he climbed into a Winnebago and made his way across the country in 2020. He writes about what pulls us apart and also what brings us together. Frank was previously the chief speechwriter on the Bloomberg 2020 presidential campaign, and earlier he was director of speechwriting for Mayor Bloomberg. And his other book points to his interest in the state of our democracy. It's titled The Scandal of Reform, The Grand Failures of New York's Political Crusaders and the Death of Nonpartisanship. Leading him in conversation tonight is award-winning journalist and documentary filmmaker Morgan Pehme. Morgan directed and produced Netflix's Get Me Roger Stone, among many other productions. He is an expert in American and New York politics. He's been a political analyst for PIX11 for the past decade. He previously served as editor-in-chief of City and State magazine, and he's written for the New York Times, New York Daily News, Daily Beast, and the Washington Post. So please help me welcome Frank and Morgan to the stage.
Well, it is my tremendous honor to be able to do this Q&A with you, Frank. I'm actually really just so, it's your book is so remarkable. I knew from reading The Scandal of Reform that you were a talented writer who takes on important subjects. You really convinced me that nonpartisan elections should be the norm in our municipal government. But what I wasn't anticipating was a book that I feel like is like de Tocqueville's Democracy in America for our times. The ability that you have to just so keenly observe our country and to look at it with fresh eyes and for us to take that journey with you is just remarkable. And I hope that if you haven't already purchased this book, that you will so. So I wanted to start off by asking you about the Lincoln Highway. I didn't know until reading your book that there's actually a sign in Times Square that marks the start of the Lincoln Highway. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I imagine I passed that sign a million times and never saw it. And so like the Lincoln Highway was essentially hiding in plain sight. How did you discover it, and what filled you with this desire to traverse it?
Well, thanks for that too kind introduction, and thank you, Marcia, for having us here. Most people have never heard of the Lincoln Highway, and I stumbled upon it in 2016 when the country was seeming to be coming apart at the seams over the election, and I was looking for a way to talk about or to explore the divisions facing the country in a way that also pointed to what held us together. And I kind of just accidentally stumbled across the Lincoln Highway. There is a sign right at the corner of 42nd and Broadway. It says the Lincoln Highway. It starts right there. And I thought, oh, this could be a great way into the story, because no one held the country together more than Abraham Lincoln. And so the idea of driving the Lincoln Highway became this kind of dream. But life overtook me, and then the 2020 presidential campaign happened, and then COVID happened, and my wife Laurel and I were sitting around staring at each other, and we realized that it was kind of now or never for doing this thing. And in 2020, all the divisions that I had been thinking about in 2016 were even more intense, and so the story seemed even more apt, and so we began thinking about actually doing it.
Well, as you discussed in your book, the Lincoln Highway was essentially, like many things in America, just kind of devised as like a commercial ploy to sell automobiles, right? And so it's a little ill-defined because it's not like the interstate where it just cuts across the country, but it's a patchwork of roads that were woven together somewhat artificially. And so
it was a marketing gimmick.
It was
essentially a marketing gimmick for the early auto industry. It was created in 1913 when very few people had cars. There was very little driving, but more importantly, there were very few roads. And so this guy, Carl Fisher, who was a pioneer in the auto industry, thought up this idea of, let's connect the country, call it the Lincoln Highway. We'll inspire local governments to build good roads. That will lead people to build cars, and everyone will get rich. And in the process, we'll encourage people to see the country at a time when very few people really had seen much of America beyond their own backyards. But as a result of that, there was never, at least initially, a Lincoln Highway. It was just a series of local roads that Carl Fisher and Henry Joy, his partner, stitched together on a map and said, okay, we'll take this road to that road, this road to that road, and we'll make our way to San Francisco, and we'll call that the Lincoln Highway.
And so there are times when it's not really clear, right? What is the path of the Lincoln Highway? You have to kind of choose your own adventure there, right?
Yes.
And what really struck me is how thematic every single step of the way seems to be in your telling. And I was wondering, and particularly on the way back, you don't take the Lincoln Highway, you take the southern route across America. Was it planned, the route, or was there an element of providence in how you stitched together the experiences and the places that you stopped at along the way?
It was a little bit of both. We planned to drive the original Lincoln Highway as much as we could. It still exists, and a lot of it, though, is dirt roads, but we were determined to stick to it as closely as we could. So that was the planned part. That said, we were doing this on the fly. We decided to do it really in August. We left on September 11th. Wasn't a ton of time for planning, so we were making it up as we went along. And so there was a lot of good fortune that came into play for us, too.
20 years ago, before my wife and I were married, we drove cross country. My wife grew up in Poland, and so this was really the first time she had gone west of Pennsylvania. And just being a cynical New Yorker, it was also an eye-opening experience for me. And what we found was just how wonderful and kind people were everywhere we went, which was very much the experience that you had. And it really endeared us to this country and made us feel that we were knit together as a union and not just like a hodgepodge of states. And I was wondering how far apart you think that we are as a country at a time when so many of us think that we are, at a point where there's no way that we can still stay together.
Right. Well, one of the goals of the trip was to escape the national news cycle, to get out of the 2020 campaign, and to not focus on Trump and Biden, but to speak with people in their home communities about issues that were important to them, national issues, but from a much more local perspective, a human perspective. And that is a great way to kind of transcend the things that otherwise trip up relationships and cause conversations to break down. And so we had the same experience. People were very welcoming. People across the country found very eager to share their stories. It was we were traveling during the pandemic, so it was a weird time, but people had a little bit more time on their hands. Everyone's schedule was screwed up, so they're willing to take a little bit more time with us, which was wonderful. And the more you talk with people, the more it was impossible not to feel those common bonds, that there was so much more in common that's not in the headlines, that's not on social media, that's not what you're getting fed on the nightly news, but it is what you end up talking about. And there's tons of, I think we came away with a big sense that there was much more holding us together than we often realize as we kind of see all the divisions around us and feel the intensity that all of that represents.
In making movies about American politics, I've found that it was incumbent upon me to try to do what you did, which is to find ways that we can come closer together rather than pushing us deeper into our partisan corners. But I've also found that there's a lot more appetite for the parts of my films where we can feel like affirmation that we are on the right side and the other side is wrong.
Right.
And that there hasn't been a lot of appetite for finding this middle ground. Were you worried when you set out to write this book that there wouldn't be an audience for it?
That's what my agent told me. That it's hard to sell a book to the middle, that it's easy to sell a book to the left and the right. But I wasn't interested in doing that. And that's not what our story was. And I think there is an appetite for whether people are in the middle or not, for kind of recognizing a bit more of what holds us together. So,
thinking about a lot of this book is an examination of ourselves and like what we need to find in our characters in order for us to find a way to live together in harmony. And it made me think about how our perception of what is human virtue has changed over time. If you go back to the Socratic virtues, where you're talking about courage and moderation and justice and wisdom, like those are not the things that we put to the fore anymore. And for me, what really resonated with me is your emphasis upon the Lincolnian virtue of humility, which is something that we almost never hear about, this idea of humility. Talk about the importance of that, of finding humility in ourselves as a way to bridge the divide.
Yeah, it's such an important theme running through the book. We start out on our way to the Lincoln Highway, passing Federal Hall in Lower Manhattan. And I very briefly quote Washington's inaugural address, because if you go back and read it, its most famous lines are not some of the most interesting lines to me, which are him expressing his own doubt in his own abilities. He talks about his deficiencies as a manager, essentially. And that kind of jumped out at me, because if you read anything of Lincoln's, there is so much humility in the way that he, in his writings and in the conversations that are reported. So the Cooper Union speech, which many of you are probably familiar with, is most famous. He gave it in 1860. It launched him to the presidency. And it's most famous for the closing sentence that says, "Let us have faith that might makes right." And often forgotten at the end of that sentence that closes the speech is the phrase, let us do our duty And in that faith, let us do our duty as we understand it. And those three words, as we understand it, are really important because it was Lincoln expressing an awareness that he may not have the full picture of things, that he may not be 100% right. And you can see that show up in so many different aspects of Lincoln's life and writings. He has this great quote about how government policy is almost never wholly good or wholly evil. It's usually a compound of the two, and the trick is to figure out whether there's more weight in the good or in the evil. And that's just a way of looking at politics that is often so foreign to the way we do it now, where righteousness reigns, and people are convinced that the kind of their own moral absolutes, and that there's a certain inherent conflict if that's the way you're going to look at politics. And so throughout the book, I try to draw that spirit out of Lincoln because I think there is a lot of value in it to us today.
You have been involved in politics, both on the presidential level here in New York, on the local level. And there seems that there is always this sense that politicians can never say that they don't know. Right? They always have to have like some clear answer, some clear agenda. And it's like one of the worst things that you can possibly admit is like your fallibility as a human. And I wonder, and I feel like that spills over into our own politics where, I mean, I fully am aware of just how ignorant I am about so many things and what a flawed human being I am, and yet we are not allowed to speak about that in terms of our politics. Why do you think that is the case?
Because it's an opportunity for opponents to pounce, and so every political consultant will tell a candidate, don't do that. But I think when people do it, it also reveals some humanity that voters recognize. And so I think there is value in doing it. I worked in City Hall for many years under Mayor Bloomberg, and when he didn't know the question, to his credit, sometimes he would say, I don't know, let me ask a commissioner. But that is not something that you typically see. Even more rarely is saying you're wrong. So candidates, politicians don't like to admit they don't know something. They especially don't like to say they're wrong. What is most remarkable in some ways about Lincoln is in the midst of the Civil War, he did not damn the other side. He did not say, that we are on God's side. And he expressed hope that he was acting in accordance with God's will, but left open the possibility that the South might be. And again, that ties back to humility, but it was a willingness on his part to recognize that he wasn't certain of all the answers and might be wrong.
Yeah, and that's what's such an illuminating portrait of Lincoln that you've painted, because there is this sense that like the battle lines were drawn with certainty, that Lincoln had such a clear vision moving forward, but in fact he was always agonizing over his.
He was always agonizing, and just as importantly, he was always calculating. Lincoln was a politician who was masterful at recognizing where the public was and trying to push and nudge and lead the public in the direction that he thought the public should go, but not getting too far ahead either. And so, the Lincoln Highway goes through Gettysburg. We stop, of course, in Gettysburg. I have this amazing tour of the battlefield with the gentleman who runs the Civil War Institute there. And he points out in the Gettysburg Address that Lincoln never mentions emancipation, never mentions slavery. Why? Because it's still in the midst of the Civil War. He's reluctant to alienate border states. And so the Gettysburg Address is perhaps the most beautiful speech given in American history, and yet it elides the big issue that is facing the country for political reasons. And it's not that he was wrong to do it, not saying that at all, but it reflects his awareness of how important it was to speak to people in terms that would not alienate them, but that would still move them in the right direction. And that's how we get New Birth of Freedom. That's how we get government of the people, by the people. I mean, that's how we get so much of Lincoln's beautiful, inspiring language.
Yeah, and although I think we all understand the nature of real politic, we look down upon it in practice, right? And when the fact that Lincoln was willing to, that he wasn't trying to push it to the limits of his principles, but that he understood that you could only go so far without losing the country, and that were he to be too insistent upon his views, that it would actually have the reverse effect. I mean, that's something that you wrote about just this week in the Washington Post.
Right. Lincoln would never have been elected president had he been an abolitionist. In fact, one of the biggest reasons he was nominated in 1860 was that he was not an abolitionist, and he was less associated with the abolitionists than our governor here in New York State, Seward. And so Lincoln was constantly kind of calculating where he was deeply opposed to slavery. There's plenty of quotations and writings from him expressing his views on it quite clearly, viewed it as a moral abomination. But always for Lincoln, the goal was holding the country together and also advancing his career in ways that would do that. And so Lincoln has to make compromises and decides that he'd rather be victorious than virtuous in some cases. And that, of course, was much to our benefit.
At one point when I was reading your book, I was on a plane with a friend of mine, and I was just marveling at what I felt like were your insights into this country. And I was just telling my friend about it, and he's like, it's surprising to me that anybody who worked for Bloomberg could have anything valuable to say. And he's a progressive New Yorker.
Yeah.
And then I thought, wow, first I was disappointed in my friend, but then I was also thinking about, like, here you are, you're a white, straight, middle-aged man in America today. And I'm sure there's a lot of people who will think, who the hell are you to opine on what can bring us together as a country? Was that a concern of yours?
It wasn't really a concern of mine, because people who are going to think those things are going to think those things. And it's, you want to draw people into the story. I tried to be very upfront in the opening of the book. I'm not trying to pretend to be somebody I'm not. I'm very clear about my own political background. And I think that's important. I say in the book, if you're going to take a trip with someone, you want to know something a little bit about them. You want to know a little bit about what their politics are. You don't want them to be trying to hoodwink you or fool you into something. And so I'm hopeful that invitation, as I say in the book too, that's okay to disagree with me at various points. That's what this whole thing is about, is these conversations and disagreements. And we need to be able to have those disagreements without someone kind of just walking away or deciding, oh, you're a Republican, you don't have anything smart to say, or you're a Democrat, I'm not going to listen to you.
What's one of the things that's so fascinating about your book is that we take the journey with you in real time during a time of enormous consequence. And you leave New York on September 11th with the destination of Golden Gate Park on Election Day 2020. And in a lot of ways, I feel like your journey westward is like imbued with a lot of hopefulness. And then because of the contested election, because of Trump's desire to challenge the results, you take kind of a more depressing journey back in the lead up to January 6th. And we feel that in your journey. And I just I wonder first about that how your own feelings about the country changed during that time. And then I also wonder about these questions of, I'm sure many people think, how do you try to hold the union together with people who want to destroy the union? How do you govern alongside traitors? And these are questions that Lincoln himself had to grapple with. What were Lincoln's answers to them, and are they still germane to our country today?
Yeah, I mean, the story was supposed to end on Election Day. The idea was to get to San Francisco on Election Day, which we did. And the thought was, well, we've taken this trip across the country to see what holds us together, and now it's Election Day, our great national civic tradition, and we're going to have a new president or at least a reelected president, either way. But that didn't pan out that way. And so the election, even though it was technically over, continued to be contested. And so in a journey about the exploration into democracy, here we were getting, unfortunately, this real-time test of it. And so it was terrible for the country. It was great for the book because we got to explore other, of course, ways that we have encountered these tests. And so what would Lincoln say about it? I mean, Lincoln was willing to do anything to hold the country together, including a constitutional amendment that would have guaranteed slavery where it existed. He also, though, and this is, I read lots of Lincoln, as you might imagine, in the lead up and after the trip, and there's some Lincoln history that doesn't get a lot of coverage in his biographies, but that have taken on even greater importance now. And a couple of those things are, in August of 1864, it looks like Lincoln is going to lose the election. And he writes a document that he makes every member of his cabinet sign without telling them what it is. But what it is a declaration that he's going to help the next president during the transition period, which was between March and November at that time, in order to save the country. That he believed that it was very likely he was going to lose, but he was going to help the next president save the country. And he essentially reiterated that very same commitment in October, in the weeks leading up to the election. And so here we are in the height of the Civil War over a moral issue that he considered an abomination that was tearing the country apart. And what was he committed to? This peaceful transfer of power. They were holding the election, and no matter which way it went, as he said, is this great phrase, we're about to begin, I'm paraphrasing, we're about to begin this new voyage, and I want to be sure that whoever takes the helm is in the best possible position to save the ship. And that should be a timeless lesson from Lincoln, and it's one that has kind of gotten lost underneath everything else. We went across the country and saw tons of Lincoln quotes that were sometimes attached. A lot of the communities were really proud of their Lincoln Highway status, and so we saw lots of Lincoln quotes, and many of them were totally fake because everyone loves to make up a Lincoln quote and pretend that it's from him. But we never saw those quotes, and those are really important to remember.
I think that, from my personal experience, that Americans generally love America, that they buy into at least the notion of America, and do want America to survive and to prosper. But I wonder about whether we really buy into the notion of the republic as the founders envisioned it, because I find when I try to examine where people are coming from with their politics now, that most of us actually want a tyranny. You know, what we hope is that our views will be able to tyrannize the other, that we will control every level of government, that we will be able to impose our will on the other side, and that's what's going to fix the country. I wonder if you think that we are really invested in trying to perpetuate the Republican values upon which this country was founded.
Yeah, I agree that they're in tension and that they've always been in tension. And that's one of the things I try to show on the trip and traveling the Lincoln Highway and digging up some of the history along the route, is that these conflicts have been with us from the very beginning over people's belief that we're gonna govern to benefit ourselves. We're gonna govern. This is the whole history of xenophobia. That the otherizing, those people, that's the problem. We just need to keep them out, and that's still with us, of course. And it's a constant struggle. And what has allowed us to sustain the struggle is a commitment to freedom and democracy and equality. But it's always going to be tested. And it's not a guarantee that you're going to win each test. And we've had plenty of setbacks along the way.
But as I'm sure as you said at the outset, one of the reasons that you wanted to undertake this book is that if you look at Plato's Republic, what follows democracy is tyranny in the sequence of how governance goes. And I wonder if you fear that we are on the precipice of losing our democracy because the inability for us to work together ultimately breaks down into having a demagogue, strong man who's going to come in and exact, their one side's view upon the others.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a concern. But I also, one of the biggest takeaways from the trip was faith in the resilience of the country and faith in. We heard this from lots of different people. They expressed it many, many different ways, but their own faith in the ideals that we talked, democracy and freedom, and their belief that America would overcome this. And so, I mean, strong men are not new. Demagogues are not new. What did end up being new on the trip was, of course, storming of the Capitol and the high-level organization of the Stop the Steal movement. And so this is kind of the next front in the battle to preserve American democracy. But the battle is not new. And that's why Lincoln is such an important North Star for the journey. It's one we've really been, it's a battle that we've had going on since the earliest days.
But is it worth preserving the Union if we have to put aside the principles that are most important to us? I think it's very fascinating to think about the fact that Lincoln was willing to compromise to accept some degree of slavery in this country. It's abhorrent to think that was something that he was considering, and I think that's something that a lot of people are unwilling to accept, the compromises that are most that go against the things that are most important to them. Where do you draw the line?
I agree that it's a tough conversation, but in the end, you have to think on whether or not holding the country together is going to be better in the long run than splitting it apart. And I think there's a book out a couple of years ago as we were beginning the trip, actually. I forget the title of it now, but it was essentially about secession movements, history of secession movements in the United States. There's been plenty more besides the South. And the author's take was, well, maybe we're being a little too dismissive of secession. Maybe it's not always and everywhere such a terrible idea. And it's that kind of loose talk, I'd say, is dangerous, because it's not to say the question shouldn't be discussed and debated, but I think it can be very easy to think that we'd be better off without them, whoever they are, and all of these secession movements always have a them, without kind of keeping faith in what the founders envisioned, what the Constitution and the Declaration represent in terms of the overall march of progress and the march of freedom and what it represents and the opportunity that it's opened.
For those of us who are committed to preserving the Union, who want to love our neighbors, even if they wholeheartedly disagree with us, who want to double down in preserving the experiment that the founders put forward, what does that look like? I think that so people feel like that's an impossibility, that it's Pollyannish to even talk about coming together. There was this article that we talked about earlier in the week in the New York Times about how there's this attempt to rebuild community, and in a lot of ways putting politics aside, but just finding a way to talk to people with disparate worldviews. What do you see as the way forward for us to heal the nation?
I think there are two components to it. One is a leadership component where I think people in both parties should demand that whoever they're voting for agree to accept the outcome of an election. That's such a basic thing, but I think it's a prerequisite for office, because as soon as you break that down, you start to lose the essence of democracy. And I don't think that should be a partisan thing. It hasn't been. And the idea that it could become one, I think, is quite dangerous. So that's a leadership necessity. But there's also a personal opportunity. And I've told the story a couple of times, but I met a woman in South Bend, Indiana, who was a volunteer at an abortion clinic. And it was very difficult to open the clinic. They faced lots of opposition in a conservative area, but they did. And when it opened, she decided, rather than just to be kind of constantly in an antagonistic position with the opponents who were protesting in front of their clinic every day, that she would invite a few of them over for a conversation to her home. So she did, and she hoped that in doing that, they might find some more common ground and find some happy ending. Totally did not work out. There was no common ground. They realized kind of how actually divided they were. It's a little bit like, I'm for the death penalty, you're against it. But they weren't going to compromise. But it didn't matter, because what they learned was that they liked each other, and they had a nice conversation, and they began developing a relationship and meeting again. And they wrote this article for the local paper that said, essentially, we've been doing this and we have something that we think is valuable to share, which is we've prioritized the relationship over the message, over the politics, by putting kind of a human-to-human relationship first. It's allowing us to agree to disagree. And that face-to-face contact was important for them to get there, and that's what so often doesn't happen with social media, and that's what makes it so easy to walk away. But I think the more that we can, in our own small little ways, prioritize the relationship over the politics, the more that that kind of healing can take place.
I imagine because you're trying to find a common ground and you're trying to talk sense in a way that will be palatable to people across the political spectrum, that you don't have much of a social media following.
That's true. I'm terrible at social media.
Because social media rewards extremism.
Yeah.
And once upon a time, when you ran for president or you ran from Congress, you tacked toward the partisan base during the primary, and then you came back toward the center for the general election. And ultimately, elections rewarded moderates. But now we have terms like rhinos, or if you're a liberal, you think that being, a moderate is a betrayal of your party, a betrayal of your principles. How do we rebuild being the virtues of being a moderate without looking like you're like a squish?
Well, Morgan and I have a long relationship in election reform, and so I'll briefly mention one of the issues, nonpartisan elections, we've worked on together. And so a lot of people say that we get the government we deserve. I think we get the government we design, and we've essentially designed it now to reward the extremes. Both parties run to their far ends, Republicans to the far right, Democrats to the far left. And out of that, you get lots of conflict and vitriol and anger. And all of that's reflected in social media. Lincoln Highway goes through Omaha. We did a little detour down to Lincoln, Nebraska. How could we not go to Lincoln? But we went because it's the only capital in the state, in the country, that has a nonpartisan legislature. And I wanted to talk with one of the electeds there about what it was like to run in a nonpartisan legislature and to govern in a nonpartisan legislature. And he said two things that I thought offered some hope. One is, as a nonpartisan, in a nonpartisan election, he doesn't just go knock on doors of Democrats. He was a Democrat. He's got to knock on doors of Republicans and independents and ask for their votes too. And so that means he's got to listen to them, and that means he's got to moderate his positions a little bit. And then once you get elected, the committees aren't divided up by party. And so even though Democrats, the minority party in Nebraska, they control a bunch of the committees. They chair the committees, because those elections for committee chairs aren't based on what party you're in. They're based on your relationships. And so if I want to chair a committee and I'm in a minority party, I've got to secure support from people in the majority party. So it incentivizes working across the aisle, building relationships, promoting cooperation, all the things that are totally foreign concepts in Washington, but all the things that we could do if we changed our election laws. It's not to say it's a panacea. Nebraska has its own issues. There are still flashpoints, but for decades, it has had a reputation as being one of the most highly functional legislatures in the country. So the point is, there are ways around this, and there are other election reforms that deserve consideration too. But so much of the current rules and laws are structured to reward the exact type of behavior that results in divisiveness and gridlock.
Which makes me think about how Washington warned us about the dangers of parties, and now we think that parties are just inherent as they're bedrocks of our country. And when you're talking about nonpartisan elections, right, you oftentimes see in Congress that there will be a bill that is introduced by the Democrats, and they will all get behind it, and the Republicans will oppose it. In the very next Congress, a Republican member will introduce the very same bill, and the Democrats will all turn around and vote against it because it's a Republican bill now. And that's one of the things that really convinced me in your book, The Scandal of Reform, about nonpartisan elections, is because we don't deal with ideas and issues in good faith, right? We ascribe some sort of ideology to them, and that's the only way. That's how we know to identify with whether this is on the side of good or on the side of evil. And I wonder if you still feel that way, that nonpartisan elections or a multi-party system is key to breaking through the gridlock that we are in a country.
Yeah, I think it would make a big difference, and including here in New York, where you have so many independent voters who are shut out of the process. And we need to, if we want more sane politics, which includes cooperation, then we need to find ways to promote it in the way people campaign. And nonpartisan is one really good way to do that.
Well, I'd love to open up to questions from the audience. There's a lot of meaty subjects to tackle here.
What are both of your names again? Your names?
I'm Frank Barry.
Frank Barry.
I'm Morgan Pehme.
Okay, thank you.
I hope all the questions are that easy.
First of all, thank you. I thought the talk was wonderful. You guys spoke a lot about the new sort of battle for democracy being against demagogues, against strongmen, figures such as Trump sort of threatening democracy, and the need for moderate candidates being accepted. I guess as someone who's just watched over the past 45 years or so, from Reagan to Bush, to Clinton to Obama, there's sort of been a similar story in American economics, especially with the 1% sort of amassing this huge accumulation of wealth, and the middle class shrinking, and the poorest Americans just getting poorer. Inequality is as stark as it's ever been. Home ownership rates, the level of debt, not just student debt, but home ownership debt, all sorts of debt is the highest it's ever been. The 1% have more money than they've ever had, by a much, much greater rate than in history. During the pandemic, we saw the amount of money billionaires have grow tremendously. And that includes, billionaires involved in politics. I read an article that said Bloomberg's wealth went up by $7 billion during the pandemic. And so I guess I've sort of come to understand polarization as not only sort of a culture war, but you have people who voted for Trump who sort of lost good union jobs. In the last 30 years, you have people on the left who have, very high rents. It's increasingly impossible to get a home. But then you have this sort of 1% that's been doing better and better for the past 40, 50 years. So I'd like your thoughts on how that really factors into polarization, and whether you think that sort of if we're able to create a more resilient middle class and sort of reduce that inequality, can that sort of help polarization? And if people have just more stable, healthy lives, will they be less angry at the other side and sort of less willing to engage in a culture war?
Thanks. Appreciate the question. And I agree that economics is part of polarization and always has been. The kind of phenomenon you're describing is true, but it's not entirely new in that we've been through phases of increasing intensity of wealth. And in the 1890s, that gave rise to the progressive movement. And so there is typically a political reaction against that. And it can amount to polarization, and it can amount to kind of periods of intense change, and the populist and progressive movements were part of that. We haven't gotten to the periods of intense change. What we've gotten instead is just polarization, and so we've had gridlock and dysfunction, and nothing really being done about it. And so one of the things, one of the reasons I'm mentioning this nonpartisan elections is looking for ways to escape that. But it's not just economics that's driving the polarization, because to think that, I think, would be to ignore so many other waves in history where you have intense polarization, where race and religion factor in. And race and religion have always been part of, whether you're calling it polarization or something else, but the intense divides facing the country. And that too, has come in waves. And that's some of that history is really important to the through line of the book. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I agree that economics is a part of it, but really important to think through race and religion and other factors as well.
Yeah, if I may
Yeah.
too, I just want to address. I'm with you a lot in the spirit of your question. The movie that I made for HBO about Congress, The Swamp. One of the things that I was really trying to get at was the fact that Nancy Pelosi and Paul Ryan and Kevin McCarthy, like they got along perfectly well behind closed doors, and that the party system was really professional wrestling, which was like created to polarize us, and that the special interests that really dominate our politics and are the major donors to both parties are invested in keeping us in this polarized system because that allows their influence to be sustained without any interruption. And I hope that like we can all examine that when we get so heated in these partisan battles to like realize what is the underpinning of this. It's not for these folks in Congress and in government. I oftentimes feel that ideology is a smokescreen, and that these arguments are not being had in good faith. And one of the things I really appreciate about your book, Frank, and your approach is that you go about this journey with real good faith. You are oftentimes questioning your own views. Like you grapple with things that make you feel uncomfortable. You have very thoughtful conversation about immigration. You talk about when the people that you speak with are at odds with your own worldview, but you try to hear them out. And because you don't just automatically dismiss a person's perspective as wrong, like you try to find where they're coming from. And that's not what our discourse is about. Our discourse is about keeping us polarized because that is to the advantage of the people who are really dominating this country, and that is party blind.
Hi, Frank. Thanks very much. I'm Mike, and really very interesting story. I miss Mayor Bloomberg, I must say that. In the business I was in, tourism, one of a client we had was a teacher in a middle school group from the very reddest of areas of Texas, and they'd come to New York. And the kids, they were a great crowd. And I was taken with what you said, that you find just people are very kind that you found in your travels far and wide. And these people were really, really fine people, and I got on with them very well. The two rules of thumbs were just don't talk about politics and religion, stay away from that, and everything was fine. And I was very fond, especially of the teacher. I heard from her the other day. And so it makes really kind of, because there's so much division going on, and I find so much of these charged headlines of calmness in the media and the polls and what's going on here. And then I saw for myself, these come from different worlds, these people myself, but it really worked as one-on-one. But the thing that bothers me, that I think it's a tripwire, what was in the news yesterday, that Alabama has now passed at the schools, or have to have the 10 Commandments on the walls at the schools, the public schools. And I find that very alarming. I find there's a willfulness, and maybe these people are kind too, I don't know. But there's just this, I know better than you, and I think that splits things wide open. Did you still find that you'd stumble into that when you maybe went a bridge too far?
Stumbled into what?
The division. Well, we want our 10 Commandments up on the wall there,
Yeah. Yeah, people, you could, as much as I tried to keep the conversation away from 2020 and Trump and Biden, it inevitably drifted back to it because it's such a kind of elephant in the room, so to speak. We were traveling for the most part pre-January 6th. But yeah, people dig in on what they believe. And I had this conversation with, I mentioned the head of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg. And he was talking about conversations he had with people on the battlefields. He was a tour guide there for many years in the 80s and 90s. And he said people would say the most kind of vile things about, about race and such. And when he would, sometimes say, well, the war was fought over slavery, some people would say, I'll be damned, as he tells the story, I'll be damned if you think my grandpappy fought a war over slavery. And he would say, well, you're right. Your grandfather probably he was, an infantryman. He wasn't a slaveholder, but he was invested as a white man in the social system, in the economic system, and he benefited from it. And he said, if you could kind of get someone to acknowledge that, then you could begin to have a conversation. And that was if you could do that, that was a big victory. And the point I took from it was, whether it's that or something else, one of the challenges we have is to look for those little opportunities to engage people in a way that will acknowledge where they're coming from and acknowledge even that they've got a point about something, but try to challenge them to see it from a little bit of a different perspective. And that's hard because, just to tell one other story about this, I was at a VFW hall in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I was talking with an Iraq War veteran, and he said, so many conversations now, people don't listen. Instead, they wait. They wait to respond. They know what they want. They hear what this person's saying. They've already tuned it out. They're already thinking about what they're going to say next. And what they're going to say next is a retort that tries to, prove their point and say why they're right. And so, of course, that's not really listening. And it's the opposite of what Peter Carmichael was doing on the Gettysburg battlefield. And I think we need and we would benefit from more of that. And that's not to say that you would, if you did that, for instance, with the person who, say, believed in putting the Ten Commandments in the classrooms in Louisiana, that you would agree with them. That's not the idea at all. It's not to, but it's to challenge them to maybe, if you can, kind of get them to start thinking about it from a little bit of a different perspective. And that involves some creativity. How do you go about it? It involves some patience. People are not always open to it. And those are hard things to do in conversations, and people find it easier to declare themselves right and to walk away.
It was refreshing, and you stirred my brain for sure. I think about Adam Grant. I happen to like Adam Grant. I've read his book, Think Again, 4 times. Think Like a Scientist. One of the intellectual humility. He has a Venn diagram, and part of it is what we think we know is like 25% of what's really going on. It has humbled me. It has kept me a kind and warm person. And I also think about, I've been reading some of the stories I've read that you were both sharing. I don't remember where I read them, but I read them. But Van Jones, not long ago, he did a book or a documentary where there were opiate drug users in Virginia, in a coal mining area, and then there were opiate abusers, substance abusers in California, in Oakland, and common pain, common purpose. He brought them together in Virginia, the substance abuse people, black and white, literally black and white, and they met and they sat down with each other. And the people in California had actually built institutions, okay? They had built institutions for the substance abusers to do rehabilitation, and it worked. So they were teaching the people in Virginia, the white people, what they did that worked, and they became friends. Common pain, common purpose. They were able to adapt. They were able to see the common humanity, same problem, different state, different color of your skin, but you have some positive results, and we can implement them. And they actually, as you just said, they became friends. But I'm like Adam Grant. there's so much I don't know. I'm still, I just, I don't know how to open people's perspective and tell them. It just feels so much better to recognize how much you don't know. And it's really good for your well-being and your mind and body. So I'm serious. I'm really serious. I could go on, but that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with you. Lincoln would have loved that. So I think Lincoln would have loved that.
And I think Mayor Bloomberg did a great job.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you both. This has been a really great conversation. Thanks everyone else for their great questions. You're both involved in media. And I think a lot, more broadly, not just social media, but media in general. And you've seen the move from slow media to fast media. And I think with that comes the illusion of omniscience. I have access to all of our recorded knowledge in my pocket, which makes humility very difficult. And we also have done a lot of cross-country travel. God help us. So much driving. This is a gigantic country. What hath Alaska to do with Florida? I'm curious, because Frank, what you did is, I think, really key to healing a lot of these hurts that often stem from the faster and faster seeming information that I can get. Is you got proximal to people. You went to people and were with them and listened and had face-to-face conversations and relationships. Not the illusion of like what somebody said on Twitter or whatever. Is you have these conversations and then you learn, like, I disagree with you. But like, Morgan, as you said, you know, sort of like Pollyanna-ish, but like, I can also love you as my neighbor, even if you are in Alaska or Nebraska or whatever. Are either of you, like, have you thought about this, or are you aware of, I really look forward to reading the book, but this is a slower media form, but it's still media. Are there movements toward building these kind of networks where we can have real relationship, right? Because Lincoln had to get in a wagon or whatever, ride a horse, however they got around, right? And go to the people and like give these speeches. He couldn't just blast it out on Truth Social or whatever, right? So even that was a lot more personal. Like, so I'm just curious if, as you have traversed and talked and learned, both of you, like, are there moves towards building like genuine conversation that can help us bridge that fake binary media divide?
Yes, there are groups doing really good work in this area. A group called Braver Angels comes to mind, which is, okay. So Braver Angels is doing exactly that type of work. And there are lots of good groups that have sprung up, especially since 2016, who recognize the need for exactly what you're doing, which is kind of divorcing some of these conversations from media, because it's the only way to develop relationships. That said, we need more of that. Since you mentioned Lincoln recognized the power of the press and knew you had to use it. And he bought a German language newspaper in 1860 without telling anyone, because he wanted German votes, and made sure that the Lincoln-Douglas debates were published all around the country. So he was a very savvy user of media. But you're right that it obviously is different, but media has always had vitriol in it. You look at the treatment that Lincoln got after the Gettysburg Address from the Democratic newspapers. I mean, it makes today's commentators look tame. we need exactly the more of that, the kind of the outside civic groups to work on this, because the intensity of the conversation in media is now so much more in our face than it used to be.
Well, I just really want to thank you, Frank and Laurel, who took this journey with you, for doing so, because I feel like you did it for all of us. And I hope that we will take away from your journey the desire to take these journeys ourselves. I think so. When you were it really, what you were saying about what the gentleman said in Fort Collins is that when we have these political discourses, like we're waiting for our chance to like uppercut our enemy. And that puts us all in a feeling, a stance of defensiveness, where we have to assert our own views before somebody can like say them louder than ourselves. But like what you did was you went across the country and you listened to people. And I hope that we all go home to our friends and our families and our neighbors, and we just take on the challenge of listening. And I think as all of us get older, we either get more, we either dig in more to our pig-headedness, or we realize how much we don't know. And I think the latter is what is really the nature of wisdom. And then I hope that we all realize that in our infallibility, that extends to our whole system, and that the future of the country is in listening to each other.